Welcome, friends, to the 2024 Swarthmore Lecture. My name is Mandy Cooper, and I'm the CEO of Woodbrook. The Swarthmore Lecture was established by the Woodbrook Extension Committee in 1907. The minute provided for an annual lecture on some subject relating to the message and work of the Society of Friends. First lecture was given in 1908, and it stated a twofold purpose. Firstly, to interpret and further to the members of the Society of Friends their message and mission. And secondly, to bring before the public the spirit, the aims, and the fundamental principles of Friends. This time last year, I hadn't heard of Woodbrook, but I did know about Quakers. And that was entirely due to the work of someone here in this building. 10 years ago, I was here for a mental health training course. Nothing to do with faith, and even though I'm Christian, I didn't know anything about Friends House until I saw all the signs and posters. I arrived for the training course early, and while waiting in reception, I was interested in a display that someone here had taken the time to create. It focused on the work of Quaker William Tuke. Over 200 years ago, Tuke had looked at mental health treatment and, being sure there was a better way to help people, and despite the derision of his peers, in 1796 opened the Retreat at York, with an entirely new model of mental health care, with a moral and humanitarian emphasis. In that moment, William Tuke and I connected across 2 centuries. I had similar contemporary ideas about making changes in my profession and was enduring similar derision. But out there, through those doors, I found my ally. As years progressed, I continued to talk about William Tuke and the adventurous work of Quakers at every possible opportunity. In journal articles, as a conference speaker, and in 2019 in Parliament, and as a contributor to the Parliamentary Review. I told anyone that would listen, this isn't a new idea. William Tuke and the Quakers did this first. And when I joined Woodbrook in December, the first place I went to learn more of these adventures was the Swarthmore Lectures. For anyone that wants to know more about what Quakers do, or think, or dedicate their time to, I recommend that you watch, listen to, or read this incredible body of work spanning 116 years that talks about social action, equity, and peace. The Swarthmore Lecture continues to be a vital part of Woodbrook's commitment to research, an inspiration long after the lecture itself has been given. And I believe it also encourages each of us that our individual stories, our thoughts, ideas, and desire for justice can and do affect change. And tonight, we're gathered in this building and online, whether nearby or across the world, as one community together to listen to this year's lecture given by Ben Jarman. Ben is a senior research fellow with the Institute for Crime and Justice Policy Research based at Birkbeck, University of London. Ben's extensive research considers the ethical experiences of men serving mandatory life sentences for murder, how they make sense of their situation, and what moral messages are communicated by this punishment. A subject that society might prefer to forget. that we might feel entitled to push from our minds, and that may also challenge us. But that's the point, I think, to take these moments in time together, connected, as we listen to one person offer their insight, their learning, their experience, and the lens of faith via which they try to reconcile the parts of life that cannot easily nor neatly be tidied away. I am convinced by Ben's commitment and calling to this subject, and encouraged that the Swarthmore lectures serve, even beyond such important subject matter, as a reminder of the potential within every one of us to hope for better. The lecture is given as prepared ministry, and so it is the practice not to applaud at the end, but to sit together and reflect in stillness for a few moments. The end of the lecture will be signified when Ben and I shake hands. You will have an opportunity to ask Ben any questions on Monday evening during our Meet the Swarthmore Lecturer Q&A, which is held here at Friends House and also online. And there will also be a publication later this year. So please let's now settle into the silence and uphold this space together for the 2024 Swarthmore Lecturer, Ben Jarman.
Well, thank you, Mandy, for the introduction. Thank you to Woodbrook and to the Swarthmore Committee for inviting me to give this lecture. And thank you to you all for coming here to listen to me. This evening, I'm going to discuss some big ideas, including justice, punishment, rehabilitation, belonging, and what the American prison chaplain and sociologist Reuben Miller calls the gift of proximity. Miller urges academic researchers to engage closely with individuals in the penal system. He warns against viewing people through the lens of abstractions like rehabilitation or through metrics such as reoffending. Miller quotes the American death penalty lawyer Brian Stevenson, who suggested that to understand the lives of others, we need to get close. I want to share how the gift of proximity has changed what I know, making it more complicated, less certain, richer, and more real. And I want to invite you to think about how you, as Quakers, how we, as Quakers, might also try to get close to the system which acts on our behalf to respond to crime. I also want to warn you at the start that some of what I have to say may feel quite heavy. I'm going to begin by introducing you to three friends of mine. They were all released from prison in the last 10 years after they served long sentences for violent crimes. They received valuable help in prison to address the harmful behaviour which put them there. None of them has gone back. None of them uses violence anymore. No more victims, as the saying goes. And in one sense, these are success stories. To protect their privacy and the privacy of others, I've changed a lot of the names I will use this evening. So I'm going to call my friends Nellie, Lamana, and George. Nellie has thrived since he was released from prison. When he was in there, he confronted the trauma of growing up around a violent, authoritarian father. He speaks of the therapy he did in prison with relief. He credits it for freeing him from a destructive cycle of thinking which was not serving him, but he couldn't escape on his own. After his release, although his plans to set up a business faltered during the pandemic, Nellie still had secure accommodation and he made the best possible use of the contacts and services he engaged with in prison. He found a job, and he now supports businesses to cast their nets wider and hire people he calls diamonds in the rough, people like him, who've been excluded in one way or another, but just need a break. He lives with his partner, he's warmly integrated in a network of family and friendships, and despite some health problems, he radiates gratitude and joy. I love seeing him. He's the kind of person who leaves you feeling warm inside every time. Another friend I'm going to call Lamanna. For now, he's doing well, but things are complicated, and the complications come back to the fact that Lamanna arrived in this country as a child refugee. When his family fled a war in their home country, his family became separated, and for some years, Lamanna and a sibling lived alone in refugee camps. They were reunited with their parents years later in the UK, but unaccompanied children fleeing war zones are incredibly vulnerable, and Lamanna and his sibling suffered some terrible experiences, and they arrived here traumatised and lost. He struggled in school, he joined a gang as a teenager, and violence, both suffered and inflicted, became a way of life. Shortly after becoming a father, Lamanna received a long prison sentence. He was barely an adult at the time. And he also had therapy in prison, and it helped him to come to terms with his trauma. But on release, he's been facing a new challenge: citizenship. Nelly's parents were members of the Windrush generation, and Nelly was born here. Lamanna, who is much younger, was not. He isn't a UK citizen, and for a long time it has been our government's policy to deport people who've done more than a year in prison back to their country of origin. Foreign criminals is the language used to tidy away the human complexity behind this. Lamanna's leave to remain in the UK was revoked while he was in prison, and since then, while his appeals play out, he's remained in limbo. He can't work or claim benefits, but somehow he has found a kind of stability. He is a wonderful, dedicated dad with a positivity that I find inspirational, but he can't rest easy. What he's worked towards could yet be taken away. And finally, there's George. George, again, suffered very deep-seated damage in childhood. His father, who maintained a violent, abusive reign of terror over George and his family, only ended it when George's father went to prison himself for a very long time. George's behaviour as a teenager became unmanageable, leading to his exclusion from school and ultimately to his being taken into care. He was often in trouble with the law. Many interventions were offered, but they didn't get through. Sometimes people who are hell-bent on a certain path will just take it until they're ready not to. George spiralled into chaos. He was sent to prison eventually after attacking and seriously hurting someone in circumstances he still feels ashamed of today. George, too, went through therapy in prison, which instilled in him a desire to help others to avoid the path he went down. In prison, he discovered that education was his thing, and he had an uncommon academic talent. When he was released, he was in a good place. He enrolled for an undergraduate degree, he found a part-time job, he juggled these commitments, and for a time, he seemed to be moving into a different life. He's not back in prison, but things haven't all been good for him, and I'll say more about why in a bit. And in all three of these cases, perhaps we can say people got what they deserved. Nelly, Lamanna, and George all paid a penalty for breaking the law. The people they hurt saw them locked away in a place where this hurt could not easily be repeated. And the rest of us were protected by their harmful behaviour being interrupted. But I want to suggest that that isn't the full story. One reason for that is that not everyone receives the benefits of therapy in prison. All three men served part of their sentences at Grendon, a prison in Buckinghamshire. it has a connection to the Swarthmore lectures. In the year 2000, the then governor of Grendon, Tim Newell, stood where I am standing today and spoke partly about his work at Grendon. The men who go there are all serving long or life sentences, usually for killing or seriously harming other people. And yet, Grendon has always been, and is still, one of the safest prisons in the country. Life there is organised around the daily delivery of group therapy. It is challenging, and it is not a panacea. Therapy only works for those who want to do it. Not everyone does. And not everyone who wants to do it can hack it. But for those who do, it can be transformative. The experiences of men who go to Grendon remind us of something important, that people who do terrible things can and do turn their lives around. But Grendon and therapy is not the answer to everything that is wrong with the system as it is now. Even when people make the changes they need to in prison, the world outside can set them right back on their heels again. The UK imprisons a higher share of its population than any comparable Western European country. As our new prisons minister, James Timpson, has commented, many of those people should never have been sent to prison in the first place. He was talking about short sentences for relatively less serious offences, which simply make it more likely that people will cycle out of prison and then back in again. A responsible government, and let's hope we now have one, would reform sentencing to do something more effective with this group. But this evening, most of what I want to say relates to a different group of people. People like my friends. People who have done serious harm. Over the long term, the biggest factor driving our high prison population is not that we overpunish less serious offences. It is that we overpunish more serious offences. We send people who do serious harm to prison for longer and longer, and then, if they work their way out again, we seem to find it more and more difficult to find places in which they can belong, or even to accept that they should. If we want, as Quakers, to be involved in the work of reconciliation and to work where we can do the most good, then I want to suggest that these most serious cases demand our attention. People who serve long sentences are the group least likely to emerge from prison and to harm others again, and they are much less likely to reoffend. So this evening, I'm going to try to point to a deeper story. It's a story about the emotions which underpin punishment, and it's also a story about exclusion and about who belongs. Whether prisons are punitive or rehabilitative, whether they function well or function badly, whether they operate on an English or a Norwegian model, and however well or badly they protect the public, whatever you think of them, basically, they consistently and always do one thing in particular. They divide people. They divide people who belong from people who don't. They enforce division. Because of prisons, we, who are good, are responding to actions by them who are bad. And the response is to create a parallel world in there where people like them belong. Out here is where people like us belong. To get back out here, they have to earn their redemption by conforming with our standards. Do we know what those standards are? Shortly, I'm going to invite you to zoom in and consider this from up close. But beforehand, I'm going to briefly ask, how does Quaker history help us approach these issues of belonging and punishment? As with our involvement in the movement to abolish slavery, we Quakers sometimes simplify the story of our involvement in penal reform. We tidy up complicated facts to better fit our narrative and our image of ourselves as progressive people on the right side of history. In this country, for example, we remember Elizabeth Fry, nicknamed the Angel of Prisons, as the driving force behind the 1823 Jails Act. It mandated sex-segregated prisons to protect jailed women from sexual exploitation. We mention less often that many of those women still went on to be transported to penal colonies around the British Empire. Similarly, it might shock us to learn that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Quakers in Pennsylvania pioneered the use of a technique we now recognise as a form of torture, solitary confinement. In trying to improve the terrible jail conditions which existed at the time, they enforced the use of what they saw as silent reflection, thinking that what worked for them would work for the criminal by reforming them. Good intentions and kindness mixed with coercion. It's a dangerous blend. And again, we might raise an eyebrow, much more recently, to read in the American Friends Service Committee's report from 1971, Struggle for Justice, to notice that one of its most impassioned arguments is against the idea that rehabilitation should ever be a guiding principle for prisons and how they should be operated. All of these past friends had good reasons for acting and advocating, acting as they did and advocating for what they did. I'm not summoning a useless sense of collective guilt, but I want to draw your attention to two things before I go on. One is, good intentions easily go awry. The history of penal reform, and not just Quaker penal reform, is rich with cautionary tales. Unintended consequence is everywhere. We have best, as Quakers, been able to avoid unintended consequences, not when we have prescribed for others from a position of power and influence what will be good for them, but when we have been up close, involved, accompanying and supporting those most affected by punishment, which has sometimes included us. Second, there has never been a natural, settled Quaker position regarding the aims of punishment, nor how we as friends should relate to them. Maybe there should be. But it is worth noticing that some friends in the past have worked within those systems of punishment to humanise them, and others have worked in high places with powerful people to try and shape their policies. And others still have made major contributions to abolitionist thought and practice, or they have experimented with alternative measures such as restorative justice, which try to take cases out of the system entirely. Quaker history offers many guides, and they don't point in one direction. And so with that said, I'm going to move from the big picture to describing things I have seen very close up. I'm going to consider what a serious case looks like, not when you read about it in the news or consider it as a policy question, but when you are involved. When I described George at the start, I left things hanging. I said he enrolled for a degree course, he found a part-time job, and he juggled his commitments and seemed to be on the verge of moving into a different life. George's story and those of many other people took a turn for the dramatic in 2019. I said that George found education to be his thing. That happened partly because of a project called Learning Together. It started in the Cambridge University Criminology Department, where I was then a postgraduate student. It organised courses at Grendon, with students from Cambridge travelling to the prison for lectures and seminars, which we did alongside students from the prison. The project grew quickly into a network. Other universities formed other partnerships with other prisons across the UK and around the world. One day in late November 2019, George and I joined over 100 other people at a conference to celebrate 5 years of the project in London at Fishmongers Hall. Many of you will remember the outline of what happened next from the news. Usman Khan, another former prisoner, was there too. He had worked with Learning Together in another prison. during a sentence imposed for offences under the Terrorism Act. He had been released around 10 months before. Usman Khan travelled to London carrying a bag containing kitchen knives, gaffer tape, and a fake suicide vest. During a break between conference sessions, he locked himself in a toilet cubicle, put on his vest, taped his knives to his hands, came out of the toilet, and began to stab people. Several bystanders confronted him, first inside the building and then on London Bridge. Using improvised weapons, a lectern, a fire extinguisher, and 2 ornamental narwhal tusks, they overpowered Usman Khan and took away his knives. Within less than 4 minutes, armed police arrived and shot him dead on London Bridge. They weren't asking questions about whether he had a real bomb. Two of the people he stabbed, Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones, lost their lives. Saskia was a friend of George's, and Jack was a friend of ours both. I'm going to share just 2 memories from that day. One is of standing with George a few hours later, smoking cigarettes in an underground car park beneath a nearby building that the police had designated as a crisis centre. Having been separated from George and the others in the chaos of the building evacuation, I arrived there a couple of hours later, not knowing who had been hurt, how badly, or why. I wanted just to find my friends, and I wanted to know what had happened. But when I saw George, something told me I could not ask. It was going to be too hard to answer. And so we stood in an underground car park, chain smoking, in the heaviest, most oppressive silence I have ever experienced. The other memory is of seeing another person, who I will call Pete, performing an act of extraordinary compassion. Like some of those who confronted Usman Khan, Pete had served a very long sentence for a very serious offence. But what I remember is how kind and how gentle and how present he was with someone else there in the crisis centre who seemed to be in terrible shape, sitting on the floor, his shirt stained with somebody else's blood, physically present and utterly withdrawn. Later, I learned about the nightmarish situation this person had found himself in, and I won't describe it. But I will describe how Pete, this stigmatised, dangerous man, who had no particular reason to care about this traumatised person he had never met before, was nonetheless sitting there with him, getting him cups of tea, and doing the work of being a little speck of light on a dark, dark day. So those are just 2 memories, and I have others. The second one, out of everything that happened that day, is the one I care most to remember. But it is a crumb of comfort. It doesn't bring back what was gone. Usman Khan stabbed 5 people. 2 of them, and him, lost their lives. A colleague nearly lost hers. Hundreds of people, inside and outside prisons, were left traumatised or bereft. There were personal and institutional aftershocks lasting for years, and the project itself is no more. This violence was world-ending. Nothing could have prepared me for it. The losses have always seemed indescribable, and yet they continue to demand reinterpretation and retelling over the nearly 5 years since this happened. Within them, however, there have been gifts and opportunities and consolations, the kind that we find when we encounter life not in a mediated way through headlines or statistics or abstractions or our preferred ideas, but up close, where there are no labels, where we are forced to pay attention, to see what is there in front of us. People professing to have changed who behave abominably, or people we are warned about offering nothing but humanity and compassion. And that's why proximity is a gift and a privilege. And like a lot of privileges, it's not very comfortable. So one thing I can say, coming from my proximity to this act of abhorrent violence, is that my attitudes have shifted. I don't think we can understand serious cases without taking seriously, and by that I mean not dismissing or tidying away, the difficult emotions that underlie the urge to punish. Punishment is a nasty word, isn't it? It's defined as the deliberate infliction of a loss on somebody you blame for doing a wrong. What feelings does the word summon up for you? Do you, like me, think of emotions that it's better not to indulge? Do you think of anger or hatred or disgust? Do you think about payback and the desire to make other people suffer? These are unquakerly words and feelings, are they not? For a long time, I grappled with intense anger over aspects of what happened at Fishmongers Hall. It consumed me, but since Usman Khan was no longer there to blame, I had to find other targets for my anger. I was angry about the media coverage, which dealt in the abstractions and the cliches that I'm trying to speak against this evening. I was angry with the inquest process, which dragged on forever and seemed to hand out blame where it wasn't most deserved. Most of all, and I'm not very proud to admit this, I felt angry with the police for killing Usman Khan on the bridge. I wanted him to be alive, to take the blame and to suffer in prison. This was magical thinking. He was already dead. I was not at all reconciled to the world as it actually was. I'm not the only Quaker to have noticed the importance of anger, though. Marion Partington's extraordinary book, If You Sit Very Still, describes how she came to terms with the disappearance, and as she found out over 20 years later, the murder of her sister Lucy by Frederick and Rosemary West. One of her themes is forgiveness. Marion Partington felt that she ought to be able to forgive Rosemary West, but, as she writes, she found these feelings of compassion premature. She writes that her mind filled up with anger and contempt, and much of her book is about trying to open herself to those feelings, to experience them fully, to follow them where they led, and to realise that reconciliation and forgiveness must be earned. In a very different book, called An Ordinary Murder, the Quaker Leslie Morland described the aftermath of the murder of her daughter Ruth by an acquaintance called Andrew Steele in 1990. Much of Leslie Morland's anger related to the legal process, which asserted ownership over this most intimate of griefs. For example, the police tried to prevent her from seeing Ruth's body. Or she heard nothing, no explanation, no words, nothing at all from Andrew Steele at his trial. Leslie Morland had to work for years for the chance to ask the questions that she wanted answers to, and she eventually got them, or not, by meeting with Andrew Steele in prison. And when she did that, she found herself unable to forgive him. I found anger difficult because, as a Quaker, it felt like something I had no right to. It felt as if I ought not to be angry, and I ought to think more positively about what should come out of this. It felt as if there was a settled and a right position, a position that I didn't occupy, which involved forgiveness or at least some ability to move on. Like these two women, I found the answer to anger, though, was to yield to it, to accept that it pointed to something important, a wrong without justice, a wrong that went unavenged. And in thinking about this, I found some words from the 1987 Swarthmore lecture by John Lampen very helpful. Writing about punishment, Lampen suggests that Quakers, quote, seem to have a horror of revenge as a motive. But, he says, even when revenge achieves nothing constructive, This at least is better than to make no response at all, which would leave all the hurt with the person who has been wronged. To Lampen, it is, quote, a kind of insult to tell people harmed by violence that they ought to be reconciled. He suggests that in such situations, the state should punish. And one reason for that, he suggests, is to limit the uncontrolled consequences of people acting on their own anger, however justified that might be. So I'm saying that justified anger and the demand for a response aren't very convenient, but they shouldn't be ignored. But anger doesn't grant moral authority. It is said in Buddhist scriptures that the Buddha once described anger as having a poisoned root and a honeyed tip. I love this image. It conveys how anger can burn us up, even as it sweetens our interactions with the world. Poison in here, sweetness out there. Sweetness in the feeling that being wronged makes us right, and that being in the right means we can demand what we please to redeem our losses. Lampen's theme and the title of his lecture is Mending Hurts. After making these claims about vengeance, he asks how the demands of justice can be met without forging the next link in the chain of hurt. He is, I think, asking a question about moral repair. He's asking, what are we to do after worlds have been ended? If we should punish, then when should we stop, and how, and why? These questions can be approached from two perspectives. One is the perspective of people who survive serious acts of violence, and the other is that of people who are responsible for it. And I have to acknowledge, sometimes, often, they are the same people, but I'm going to talk about them separately. So starting with survivors. I think we can learn a lot by hearing from people who have survived violence without having been able to rely on the state or anyone else to protect them from it or retaliate on their behalf. In her book, The Apology, the playwright and activist V sets out, in the form of an imagined letter from the afterlife, the apology that she waited for her entire life from her long-dead father, who abused her sexually, physically, and emotionally in childhood. V's father was never punished, not formally. She received only the justice she could make for herself. As is often the case for people who suffer terrible wrongs, part of the answer for her came through her work. She has worked as an activist, educating the public about violence against women and girls for most of her adult life. But this wasn't enough. In the apology, writing as her father, V offered an unsparing account, and the book is often painful to read. But her father is presented as a rounded, flawed human being with a story of his own and in a hell of his own making. Monstrous, but not only a monster. Miserable, proud, exploitative, entitled, reliant on scorn and violence to control others, a kind of poison both to himself and to everyone around him. And V insisted that his redemption had to be earned by fully accounting for the harms he did, a task that in real life he was not capable of. But his imagined apology and his account of her crimes, she says, frees her. The etymology of the word revenge helps us think about this. It suggests liberation more than annihilation. We get the word from Latin, revindicare, derived from vindicare, from which we also get vindicate, among the meanings of which is to rescue or liberate or release from a debt or emancipate, as in a slave. And V's concern in the apology is with escaping the burden her father forced her to carry, the burden of victimhood. For her, vengeance wasn't about destroying her father, but about unburdening herself. Knowing him as she did, she was able to use the privilege of proximity to uncover in the book how he was punished by the world and the selfhood of his own making. The apology took many years to appear, and V's insights were a lifetime in the making. To recover and to make new worlds and to come to terms with the loss of previous worlds takes time, work, safety, and belonging. For V, who was unable to rely on the protection of others, recovering first meant escaping, becoming estranged from her family, some of whom she loved, but who were still under her father's control. To go away, where her father couldn't hurt her. But getting away wasn't enough. Like Marion Partington and Leslie Morland, she also wanted answers. All of them, in some sense, wanted the people who had wronged them to explain themselves and to show that they understood the gravity of what they had done. And the second perspective from which we can think about moral repair is the perspective of people who are responsible for acts of harm. We're told by politicians that punishment and imprisonment hold them accountable. What does this look like in practice? It's a question I've tried to explore through my work as an academic researcher. Does prison hold people accountable? If so, how does it do that? Does accountability always look how V imagines it, like a person unpacking their deep responsibility for a wrongful, harmful behaviour? Does it look like remorse? I'm going to try to answer this question with 3 more stories, drawn this time from my research interviews. I'll describe 3 men who, like everyone else I interviewed, were serving life sentences for murder. These 3 men all said that they accepted their guilt. In fact, one of them had pleaded guilty. But this doesn't mean the same thing for them all, not at all. And I'm going to suggest that accountability, their accountability, wasn't anyway what the prison system was really interested in, and nor was it what the prison system rewarded. The first person I'm going to describe is someone I'm going to call Alf. Alf was convicted of murder after he retired. When I met him, he was in his early 80s. Violence among people in their 80s is extraordinarily rare. Risk assessors rated Alf's chance of harming others in future to be low, and as a consequence, because he was near the end of the compulsory part of his sentence, he had a good chance of being released when he faced a forthcoming parole hearing. Murder was Alf's first and his only criminal conviction. And he wanted me to understand in the interview how in the rest of his life he had been law-abiding and conventional. Towards the end of the interview, he surprised me by saying, "Do you know, I've been perfectly happy everywhere I've been in prison. I've enjoyed it." It must sound silly to say that. I found this really puzzling. But then when I thought about it, I thought, well, he liked and he got on with prison officers. They seemed to like him. They made space for him. He had held many trusted prison jobs during his sentence. And he got through his time by continuing to be the person he thought he had always been, responsible, respectable, and trustworthy. He wasn't young, but he was in good health. He had strong family support. His family, in fact, had been renting out his house while he'd been in prison, so he was going to go back and live in it after his release and have a nice nest egg to live on. And he expected to go back home. His life afterwards would have been not entirely unlike his life beforehand. And being responsible for taking a life wasn't really compatible with Alf's way of thinking about himself. And so he kind of sidelined and he kind of rationalised this aspect of his story by suggesting that his victim had been at least partly to blame for their own death. He lowered his voice when he told me that, as if he knew he was saying something he shouldn't. His attitudes hadn't been challenged. Alf's low risk assessments and the scarcity of places on rehabilitative courses in prison meant that he hadn't been offered a place because places are reserved for people who are higher risk, where there is more of a cost benefit. Put simply, Alf held himself accountable only in limited ways, and prison hadn't pressured him to go any deeper. His risk seemed to be the only thing that mattered. My second example is someone I will call Leon. Leon was very different. He was convicted in his mid-20s, and he would be well into his 50s by the earliest possible date of release. He became involved as a teenager in a local street gang, and he described living through the murder of a friend as a key moment in his development as a teenager. With that came an anger which propelled Leon very deep into what he called that life. His offence was a shooting in which another young black man died. Leon accepted his guilt, but he pled not guilty in court. Not, he said, because he was innocent, not because he was innocent, but because he saw no reason to help a racist system to do its job. One consequence of that is that he would have received a longer sentence. There is a discount in sentencing for guilty pleas. As he saw it, violence wasn't really part of who he was, but a tool of the trade and a means of survival. People in that life don't rely on contracts or the courts to settle their disputes. But in prison, with distance, Leon reflected on what it had all meant. He said of himself, before prison, "My life was a mess. I was always in trouble with the police. I was always having to look over my shoulder. I was paranoid if I wasn't armed. I couldn't go anywhere. People like to glamorise that kind of lifestyle, but they know nothing about it. You can't go out of the house because, gangsters are after you, trying to kill you. It's either you or them. It's no way to be living your life." In prison, Leon had gotten into education in a big way. He'd gained a degree, and he said that this had opened his eyes to what could have been, to how his life could have turned out differently. Like Alf, he didn't express deep remorse about the life he had taken. Unlike Alf, he was ready to think of himself as someone who habitually used violence. Unlike Alf, he'd spent a lot of time thinking about who he was and how he might change himself. Unlike Alf, he never really felt that he belonged in society before prison. He belonged in his gang and he belonged in his family. Like Alf, he still had family support, but unlike Alf, this would not mean he would be released into financial or other forms of security. So his focus wasn't on being remorseful or looking back, but on looking forward, giving himself another better chance of life after release. His phrase for this was eyes on the prize. But Leon, today, I met him in 2019. Leon is still, at least today, a decade away from the earliest possible date of release. Being accountable is not getting him anywhere, not yet. And the last story is Roy's. Roy, when I met him, had been in prison for well over 30 years. He was sent there when I was a little boy. Heavily intoxicated, he broke into a house to burgle it, but was surprised by the woman who lived there. Instead of leaving, he beat her up and then raped her and then killed her. The next day, completely unable to accept what he had done, he went to the police station and handed himself in. He knew he was going to go to prison for a very long time, and he believed he deserved no better. The stigma involved in offences like this makes them ordinarily extremely difficult for people who are responsible for them to talk about them. But Roy stood out in that he seemed to want to give an account of himself. He'd spent a long time in rehabilitative courses, and he could articulate a clear story linking his troubled upbringing to his capacity for violence. He linked parental neglect to a lack of self-respect, and eventually to the feeling that he wasn't really able to care about how his actions affected other people. He was careful, nonetheless, always to point out that the fault was all his. In other words, Roy was highly accountable. He didn't deflect blame, he took the responsibility on himself. This gave him a sense of integrity and self-respect which he lacked before. As he put it, "Without my offence, where would I be? Where would I be? Who would I be? Would I ever have had the wake-up call I needed? Would I have experienced the things I've experienced? I know it's heinous, horrendous, horrible, all the expletives you want to throw at it. But roses grow out of shit, don't they?" Roy desperately wanted other people, me, prison staff, anyone who would listen, which wasn't many people, to understand how sincere he was about being accountable. He wanted it known that he'd really gone there with being responsible about his offence, and he wanted also to be trusted to make his mistakes again. He disagreed openly and argumentatively with prison staff about what supervision measures were necessary, and that made them mistrust him, and he'd been knocked back again and again for parole. Speaking about his openness, even his argumentativeness in putting his point across, he said, "A lot of people don't like it. They resent your inner strength for some reason." So what do we learn? Before I described these three men, I described V. I suggested that for her, vengeance involved not retaliation, but escaping victimhood. I suggested that to do that, she required, at a minimum, safety, distance, and time. V and Leslie Morland and Marion Partington also seemed to want the person who had harmed them to recognise the gravity of their actions. Only V received that satisfaction, and only by retelling her father's story for herself in line with her needs. Leslie Morland and Marion Partington had to find some other outlet for their need to forgive, because the person who harmed them was unable to be accountable. With Alf and Leon and Roy, there are some interesting parallels. Our prison system, which is starved of the resources it needs to offer people meaningful rehabilitation, is more interested in their risk than in the ways they are accountable. Alf, who was closest, I think, to release, wasn't very accountable, at least not in the sense that V meant it. In fact, he came pretty close to blaming his victim. But he was low risk. He belonged before prison, he found belonging in prison, and he expected to belong again after prison. His privilege, which he brought into the prison with him, had eased his passage through the system, and it made a soft landing afterwards more likely. Leon and Roy had done more to change themselves, but they held themselves accountable in different ways. Both were readier than Alf to admit their capacity for violence. Both had suffered the trauma of victimisation in the past. Roy was soaked in shame, and he told a story which situated responsibility right within him. Whereas Leon told a story in which systemic racism and a lack of opportunity for people like him were the real culprits. What I think all of them had in common with V and Leslie Morland and Marion Partington is that after the shock of terrible violence, they all needed time and space and distance to make sense of what happened to them. The sense-making involved finding a meaningful story. And this kind of storytelling, finding a story that helps you to move forward, doesn't always mean finding the story you feel like you should have or the story other people want to hear. The story has to be open-ended. I want these examples to try to undermine some of the simplistic, abstract concepts and language we are used to using when we think about criminal justice and about prisons. Typically, we will think and talk about how the system is too punitive or not rehabilitative enough, as if it is clear what that means, as if we know what we are talking about. I'm not saying that those concepts aren't necessary. People in positions of power need a language and they need rules so that they can make fair, consistent decisions. The language which currently matters the most is the language of risk. Low risk, and you can progress. High risk, and things are more complicated. And incidentally, prisons do an appalling job of explaining to prisoners what they mean by risk, because often they're not clear. What does this mean for what people deserve? Do Alf and Leon and Roy deserve punishment or rehabilitation? How can you answer that question? Where would you even begin? What I'm getting at is that these concepts are limiting. They are familiar, and because they're familiar, we use them as though we know what we mean and as though everyone means the same as we do. We need the words, but they are policy words. They don't help us understand human life up close, where things are more individual and words take away individuality. I would like us to shift our language and to understand that these words are no more than a starting point. And I want to highlight a word you might have noticed me using a few times this evening, and that word is belonging. I don't know why Usman Khan did what he did. I don't like to speculate. But one thing I do know, and it's based on what I learned through the inquests, is that like many people who leave prison, he received the message again and again, consistently, that he did not belong. His life after release sounded, to me, lonely, pointless, and hemmed in by the terms of his release licence. Day by day, he went to the gym, he went to his flat, he played computer games, he went to the library, where his internet use could be monitored, and he applied for jobs. He met with police officers and probation staff with different roles, some with the role of supporting him, others with the role of surveilling him, including by arriving and randomly searching his flat. He was isolated, without friendships, relationships, or a job. It was not a normal life. These were extreme measures. Most people released from a long prison sentence have some licence conditions, but most are not this constraining. But they didn't stop him doing what he did. I'm not saying they weren't necessary or warranted. I'm not saying that in any way they justify his choice to do what he did. I am saying I wouldn't want to live like that. I don't want other people to live like that. I wouldn't have wanted Usman Khan to have lived like that if I'd known that was how he was living. We are all human beings. Usman Khan, Alf, Leon, Roy, me, everyone in this room. And to live worthwhile lives, we need community, we need relationships, and we need to belong. We need boundaries too. Sometimes they will be physical boundaries, like prison walls. Maybe sometimes they are personal or metaphorical boundaries, such as the boundaries created by geographical or emotional distance. But when boundaries become permanent or impermeable, they are alienating. They make it easier for people to do things that are stupid and terrible and blameworthy. So, notwithstanding the experiences of V and other survivors of violence, notwithstanding their need for accountability, I've become less interested in how people are accountable. I still think rehabilitation and punishment are both important. I think they're sides of the same coin, to be honest. I don't think they're opposites. But I'm more interested in questions of belonging. Who belongs? Where and when and how do they belong? Did they always belong? Do they hope to belong in future and believe that they can? On what terms do they belong? And with whose support can they belong more? I prefer to think about belonging because I think it's a language that's less technical and there's more we can do with it as Quakers. Thinking about belonging helps us to think about community, and Quakers like talking about community. The American Quaker, Parker Palmer, has written some beautiful things on the subject about our need to be in relationship and our need for relationships not to be too closely controlled. Palmer says of community, quote, "We, especially white middle-class folk, value community for the personal nurture it promises but ignore its challenges of political and economic justice. For me, learning together and the community it involved and the proximity it involved really sharpened those questions. It has made me think a lot harder about what a true community is. What it is, often, is uncomfortable. It is a place where unwelcome demands are made." Later in the pamphlet, same pamphlet, Palmer goes on, and many of you will know this quote, "In a true community, we will not choose our companions, for our choices are so often limited by self-serving motives. Instead, our companions will be given to us by grace. Often, they will be persons who will upset our settled view of self and world. In fact, we might define true community as the place where the person you least want to live with always lives." What I think Palmer is getting at is something quite close to the idea of proximity I've been pushing forward from the start. And Reuben Miller, the Chicago prison chaplain and sociologist I mentioned at the start, wrote the following words about what he called the gift of proximity. He said, "Being close allows me to see things that detached observers miss and to move in spaces where the policymakers rarely care to look. I have found no easy answers. A 5-point plan for policy reform cannot save us from the society we've made. But I have found people making lives for themselves in the wake of a conviction, and we must understand those lives if we hope to bring about meaningful change." Now, Miller is writing about the United States, and that is a different place to here. We have some of the same problems and many different ones. Like Miller, I think there aren't easy answers to the question of how we should better deal with the serious cases I've been talking about this evening. But also like Miller, I think better answers require proximity. As Quakers, our best work in the past has come when we were close, maybe to the people and the situations we least wanted to live with. And I think our biggest missteps came when we influenced and prescribed from a position of power and from a distance. So as Quakers, I want to ask, how close are we now to the realities of violence and the aftermath of violence? How close are we willing to be? Are we willing to really look at what becomes apparent when we are up close? If not, if we think nice thoughts about peace and harmony in a society which produces those things, or tries to, using coercion and exclusion, then are we not, in some way, the beneficiaries of coercion and exclusion? And if so, what kind of voice do we actually deserve to have? Perhaps there's work for us to do, and perhaps we can think of it as a form of peace work, creating spaces of moral repair in which people who've done harm or have suffered harm can belong. Perhaps our work is to experiment and see what might be possible. We should start with a reminder. True community, the place where anyone belongs, doesn't expose everyone to the same dangers. Those of us who've experienced violence, gang violence, gendered violence, systemic violence, state violence, any violence really, might never feel safe in a true community. No one can be forced into a community where they don't feel safe. We can't impose true community. Maybe it starts to be built in pockets. As well as that reminder, we can start with some questions. hopefully productive questions and not limiting ones. What would it look like for our communities, and here I mean Quaker as well as our wider communities, to involve more proximity, to be spaces of belonging? What would we learn? How would we be challenged? Who would we need to work with? And what kinds of outreach would be required? And those are questions that need time and thought. I've got practical ideas, but before I get onto them, I'm going to tell you one last story about belonging and community. Not very long ago, I went hill walking with a large group of people. Among them were two men I hadn't met before. One of them was charismatic with intense eyes. I'm going to call him Callum. And the other was quiet and reserved, a man of few words, taking his possessions up a mountain in a blue plastic carrier bag. I'll call him John. As we huffed and puffed up the hill, Callum asked me, "Are you a religious man?" I said I was a Quaker. Callum's tone shifted a little, and he asked me a series of questions, the kind of questions which only want to hear certain answers. Before long, Callum was asking me if I knew that my Lord Jesus Christ had died and been resurrected to save me from sin. He told me the path to salvation was narrow and steep, and the path to damnation was broad and easy, and he said that as the head of my household, I ought to set a proper example to my wife and my son. Friends, I'm English, and I'm a Quaker, and I'm easily embarrassed by awkward conversations I wasn't expecting. And so I mumbled something about how complicated I think these things are, and eventually, mercifully, I extricated myself from the conversation. Not long afterwards, I chatted with John, who mentioned that he knew Callum from church. Oh no, I thought. Not another one. But John then mentioned that he'd been released from prison less than a year beforehand. And then he said that he had spent well over 40 years there. I can't adequately explain to you how difficult that transition is. You'll have to imagine. But what I remember was the word that John used about his church, and that word was godsend. It was clear that it was the one solid place of belonging for him, which he found when he left prison. And my sniffiness about Callum dissolved right there. My theological tastes, my preference for shades of grey and equivocation over blazing certainties, and my squirming awkwardness at getting embroiled in an embarrassing conversation on a nice day out, all suddenly felt less important. I could see that John belonged somewhere, and I could tell from the way he talked about it that it made a difference. And so I'm going to finish with a few more practical thoughts, as well as some reflections on what we as Quakers can bring to these questions. I hope to bring us back into the real world. I want to say a bit more about how to get close. For me, getting close has meant following my urge to do research and to think and write more about a world I was already working in. My research and my writing have made very little difference, but they have put me close, and that has brought other opportunities into my path. Some years ago, I rented my flat for a while to someone who had recently been released from a long prison sentence, who I knew through my networks. I want to be clear, this wasn't altruism. He paid me rent to live in my flat. But it made a more tangible and real difference than all of my research and all of my writing. I was able to offer one person real, stable accommodation and an opportunity to flourish, and that person did so. It built a relationship. I know it has made a difference because I have been close. Proximity brought me an opportunity, and I recognised that owning my flat gave me a slice of real power. A tiny slice, but a real one. I would have given that power away without realising I even had it if I'd relied on the market to find me a tenant. So, what are your tiny slices of power? For many of us, they might involve time and attention. Quakers now are involved with the system in various ways. Perhaps you will hear about some of them at special interest groups this weekend. Prison chaplaincies, for example, or advocacy for prisoners with learning difficulties, or through volunteering as mentors, or with organisations such as Circles UK, which exist to create spaces of conditional, negotiated belonging for highly stigmatised people. They are all worthy causes, and it is easy to find out about them through groups such as criminal justice, Quakers in criminal justice. I recommend that you do so. But I also wonder what we can do not as individuals, but as meetings. There are resources available to help us as meetings. The Welcome Directory, for example, is an organisation which exists to help faith communities become places where people leaving prison find acceptance. Can we also be more proactive in offering our meeting houses or other properties, which are often spaces of quiet refuge and not always intensely used, for the use of organisations which need such spaces? Action isn't limited either to Quaker settings and Quaker spaces alone. For instance, the Prisons Minister I mentioned before, James Timpson's company, employs around 10% of its workforce consists of people who've left prison. Timpson also set up a network for other employers who want to do the same to help them find advice and support. More opportunities of that kind are needed because not everyone in prison wants to or can cut keys or fix shoes for a living. So find out if your employer or your university or your organisation offers equitable access to the 12 million people in the UK with some form of criminal record. Push for fair hiring or admissions practices in your organisations. These actions count, and you can seek them out if you are interested in finding and using your tiny slices of power. So you can act within and beyond Quaker spaces, but I want to finish by suggesting that as Quakers, our tradition, I think, might give us 3 distinctive advantages. These are ideas and habits of thought which we don't always fully realise, but which can be resources for proximity if we remember them. The first is that we're called to live adventurously, but we are also committed to collective decision-making, which can be quite slow. We temper boldness with discretion and discernment, and we try to include different perspectives. Maybe faith communities with more hierarchical traditions of leadership might decide more quickly than we can to become spaces of belonging, of the kind that Callum's church was for John. But maybe there are also risks to moving too fast. The right path might not always be the most urgent one. Discernment in these cases might involve listening hard to punitive or fearful attitudes within our communities and understanding that they may be deeply and authentically held. A second related advantage is our practice of listening as a form of spirituality. For me, this practice was honed by sitting in meetings for worship over years. I didn't expect, but I eventually found, that it became a resource in the kind of research I do. How do we offer our skill in listening and our practice of silence to the world beyond our meetings? Perhaps this also might help us to get close, including by listening to people who are usually silenced or ignored because their stories are distasteful or upsetting. And finally, there's the idea that we ought to answer that of God in everyone. In George Fox's writings, this phrase is not used to communicate the belief that everyone deep down is just a nice person trying to be good. Fox lived in what to us would seem an unimaginably rough and violent world. And he often used this phrase with a prophetic urgency. In one entry in his journal, he warned that, quote, "The mighty day of the Lord is coming upon all wickedness, ungodliness, and unrighteousness," and added, "The truth, the crown of glory, and the sceptre of righteousness over all shall be exalted, which shall answer that of God in everyone upon the earth." That's more like Callum's language than many of us might like to think. George Fox, I don't think, was trying to say that deep down people are just nice and trying to be good. He was suggesting that every one of us has the capacity for good and evil, and that the truth is waiting for those who take these dual capacities seriously and try to turn away from the capacity for harm. So if we want to build belonging and true community, then we also need to practice caution. If we encounter mistrust or anger or disgust or fear, then these emotions will sometimes be warranted. But if we're close, if we're up close, then in them we might recognise an echo of what makes us feel mistrustful, angry, disgusted, and fearful. And we can use that echo to forge connections. Proximity allows us to recognise shared human experience and to reach out imaginatively. It reinforces belonging by challenging us to make it. And that is creative work. It must be done up close. It can be painful and disorientating and difficult, but it matters.